So really, truly, the main principle shared between philosophy, observational sciences, which are emergent today in this break off of philosophical studies. I'd say Slavoj Žižek would probably be a good example. Maybe even Jordan Peterson, where these people can have an education and an aptitude in a given field, but tend to break off into a niche that seems a need that needs to be addressed in society. And there's more of these pocketed niche requirements, right? It's almost like discovering that human beings require more of a particular nutrient that was just broadly looked over, right? It's the new science of the new man, if you will. What Nietzsche really wrote about, in my opinion, and represented is that there's a very warped view of the quasi-individual, the person who misidentifies bold or courageous as brash, and becomes a bully, but they ride on the streams of not only having relatives and installed through nepotism that will give them a false sense of security, but also they identify with others in a networking, and you will find there that they are bowing to a particular cult that is burning this wicker man, that is hanging the superior man on a cross, right? So what is the superior man? You have to be able to identify this. Well, this cult works from a very early age to sabotage this. So you could say it's a combination of the underground man, where you have Dostoevsky looking at this and going, the one that's being screwed over, or Herman Melville really identified this, right? In that whale of moral denial that you cannot readily see out in the open. But Michael Segru has a really good discourse on this, and you'd say God rest his soul, but he lives on in the algorithms, right? Highly needed. And then, of course, you've got Nietzsche, who many people like Michel Foucault, Heidegger, have sort of, in a broader sense, reinterpreted this in their own way. And they may not have. So you can tell when a philosopher becomes more forensic, and that is they no longer feel comfortable personalizing. I believe Einstein was really one of these people where he was extremely sensitive as an individual, an outcast. You put him in a room with 100 people, he's going to be the most recluse, bizarre oddity. But in that, despite what anyone says, you may not have had the hailing genius of the time, like is espoused to, but you did have somebody who was remarkably gifted, right? And everybody wants to tear him down to this day, and that's the proof, right? So you have this cult that works nonstop to destroy the superior man. And again, we identify what is the superior man. We go down the credentialing, not the credentialing of the people who make it through into mediocrity, into and through mediocrity, through matriculation, right? Or the athletes that are just merely technicians that are being overpaid, that knew that they just had to come up with this number, and that they had been born and bred to come up with this number, this batting average, this minimal standard, right? Where not only in physics, but in sports psychology, we don't have better people. We don't have better performers. And that to me is an oddity in itself, right? Is that you don't have this gauntlet outside of sports enhancement drugs. You don't have a superior individual. You have a shrinking ideology of, again, the brash, over-bolstered, overfed, let's just say it, the fat little child who thinks that this overgorging and this abundance given to them by their abuela or their parents or their familia, right, is that they're going to end up building an impenetrable skin. In their mind, it's an impenetrable skin. It's a superpower, and they're not fat, right? They don't have just this big gordo layer of fat over them, right? And it becomes obnubilated, the idea of self, this warped idea of self, until finally, through all the little machinations and the shit talking and the coercion and going about what they always do and what they were taught from a very early age, which is espionage. Right? You have a whole country full of espionage agents that say one thing and do another. Like, their operations are, the minute they have the opportunity, they are the ones who jump in to the chismoso, to the chatter, right? And create an implosion of self-annihilation where, so what is the superior man? The superior man sees the system and will jump in as whatever part, not that the superior man is in a play, but whatever part he needs to, literally like a machine, right? Where the superior man will jump in and manage if need be, or work in lower operations, do whatever it is to keep the machine going, right? Until the entire system breaks down, when the superior man no longer sees the reason or the cause for these so-called heroics. But he never did it to be a hero. He did it to express and solidify principles that no one else could see, in the hope, the esperanza, the hope that others would catch this incendiary fire of this gauntlet, this Promethean flame. But it's not carried forth. It's not understood, and success is merely a supplication back into capitalism. And when people realize that their niche is to become a technician, it is not to really master anything. And so we're missing masters as a result, right? This execution of the superior man and the anger and the jealousy of the superior man, that a man could understand something beyond himself, that he could sort of like this, this euphemism, analogy, or scripture of meet me halfway, right? Meet God halfway, that you would have to, that you could even bear the dryness, right? The the barren dryness of the desert and still survive. Somehow with your organs intact, somehow you gain back your cognizance, somehow you gain back your electrolytes and your water balance, and there you are. You have survived something that very few have, because they were out in the desert to prove something. They were out in the desert as mere technicians when the cameras were on, right? When they got full credit. So, in this sense, the superior man is the one who ultimately is broken down into Dostoevsky's underground man, to where he is he is much like Raskolnikov. And I think there's been way broad misinterpretations of law, and how Raskolnikov really, through Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, represents true law, right? Where all of this this popularity-based legal infusion based on the brash consumption toward populace, right? That somebody just had to fit into a certain class and they would do whatever. And if they came from a crime family and were taught terrible mistruths about how to interact in society and how to just get ahead today and then pass on that gauntlet tomorrow, and that this is how you do it, is that you tear down, you single out. You may not be able to take out the superior man by yourself, right? But the superior man is busy at work, right? Mastering and trying to up the level, not for himself, not even for everyone else, but for principle, right? While the chismoso, the chatter that's occurring around him, is trying desperately to bring him down, until society was finally based on this as not this sort of covert cult, but something that's accepted out in the open, which we call cancel culture, right? Which is alive and well, until you have someone like Trump, who's instated, who comes from crime. Fred Trump, Mary Trump, the brothels, the movement of this money into real estate, this mediocre lineage and mediocre line that couldn't master, like Trump. He never mastered anything physically. He never mastered anything mentally. And you could argue to say, well, he mastered people. No, he didn't master people. He couldn't have a decent conversation, mano a mano, one-on-one with anyone, right? Where there's this dialectic in exchange occurring, right? This coitus in conversation. He couldn't do that. He couldn't stay within the parameters and offer anything of substance, right? There's no substance there. There's no value. And so he's ridden on the rails, just like Epstein, with covert operations, befriending people that were in these inner circles that would bolster their self-confidence without bolstering their competence. So you have these people who are entirely incompetent, running the country, running the world. When you say running, what are they really doing? Well, they're keeping these volatile markets alive through this disparate mechanism of convincing. Let's face it, now we have a superior people that are the outcasts, right? This is written about throughout biblical antiquity. Not that validates anything, but when we look at these people who are outcasts, and they're without a home, without a country, but they are still regarded with respect, right? You have to begin to scratch your head and think of this as an oddity. Like, why would there be a campaign to, disavow them from land ownership, right? Or to pass legislation and laws locally in a particular province so that No, these people are actually committing crimes just by trying to stay alive, right? So we have this type of social outcast system. You could call them pariahs. There's a lot of different names. There's a lot of pejorative names that have been um, fashioned for that exact purpose, right? And the irony is that the witch hunt would be the Salem witch hunt would be resurrected and used in such a way when there really were witches, right? There really were people doing black magic. There really were spell workers, right? And it's really not like, if you want to really see how this black magic works in a very rudimentary descriptor, but that provides sufficient information, it's that if no one is praying for you, if there isn't this conduit of positivity flowing to and through you, and you aren't so brash and bold and brazen as to place yourself as the highest moral interest, right? Which capitalists do. The people who capitalize on other people's suffering, that's what a capitalist is. When somebody is speaking ill thoughts and conceiving and plotting ill, even if this only comes out in the chatter and the gossip and the annihilation of rumors and the expounding, right, of partial truths into the full-blown mechanism of taking someone out because you're jealous of them. And when you break it down, if you want to ask yourself, am I being one of these people? Like, we've all been there. Am I trying to take somebody out merely because I'm jealous? Is this person cocky, as is being espoused to by the broader collective, right? By the consensus, which is the most dangerous aspect of all. Because these very weak people who seem to stay afloat, they always have a nice house, they always have a nice income. They tend to try to dress down and act like they don't have what they have, but they are the hoarders, right? They're the people who don't know what to do with this collection of material because they never really earned anything, right? They learned how to manipulate and steal, and they're not these masterminds, right? They're not diabolical. What they are, again, is they're the people who set in to gossip in order to garner and gain someone else's energy, right? They deplete the system. They deplete the energy stores within a particular system or a particular network of people who should have matriculated and culminated into something that grew. And the only things that can grow are parasitic in our culture. The institutions are parasitic. The companies are parasitic, right? When you think that you've found something good, it turns sour and you expect it to. The Amazon of, 15, 20 years ago versus today, right? The original modicum of intention that you may have seen with the original members of Sam Walton's Walmart, right? Where only the people who arrived early got the pieces of pie, but they were inducted into this greed networking system where you see this with all these sort of Stanford, experiments between the marshmallow test and, then you have the brown eye, blue eye test and all these other operational programming systems in play. But they show you how the induction of this type of mechanism works, right? In reality, in truth, right? In everyday situations. And so the game of the Good Old Boys Network isn't the Good Old Boys Network when we look at it in finality. It is supplicating to the cult that abounds and flourishes in every societal niche, right? Where you have in a hotel, you have you have the people that are cleaning the rooms, the people who do the laundry, the people who deliver the luggage, right? And in these, you have these little cliques and these little niche collectives where the intelligence of this thing as a language model begins to self-assemble in the oddest sort of way. The energy that is promoted localized, so you could almost see it as cells, right? Where you have these viral cells that are ill, right? And like a cancer cell, there's no oxygen, right, left. So the cancer cell begins to identify other means, like glutamine, right? Other means by which to survive, right? And the cancer has to be killed. And the way that the only way that the cancer can be killed is not by trying to kill the cancer, but by generating and creating a flourishing, healthy networking system of a true language model that is based on principle, and true principle outcome. So people would begin to argue, right? These people are contrarian. They've learned to be contrarian. They're not the people who would be able to stand face to face with you and carry through an argument. They're the ones in the crowd who go, who are you to say that purity is important? And how do you identify purity? And so when you came and you said, look, clearly in your nephew, in your niece, right, in your self, idea of self, once you no longer have this pure center, you lose yourself and you realize the value in that, right? And these aren't people who would go into self-reflection. They're constantly passing the potato, right? Musical chairs, hot potato, right? These games teach us this, right? The merry-go-round. We're constantly being inundated and taught this on a scalable network of systems and systems logic, to where the system is supposed to fail itself and we are supposed to capitulate back down to a finite amount of entropy through agitation. And people don't want to come forth and say, yes, this is what's happening, because there's no self-reflection. There is only contrarianism, right? So you don't have this diabolical singular person at the center of this conspiracy. What you have is people who have learned how to, and this is not addressed nearly enough, right? You could say it's a pack mentality, right? But it's a pack of the beta. If the wolves could talk shit, right? If there wasn't this law of, no, alpha wolf's gonna come over here and bite you in the neck and show you, no, you need to listen to me. I'm stronger, I'm more powerful, I'm given this, the gauntlet, right? The Promethean flame by an unseen force. And I know that if you don't chill the fuck out, we are not going to make it over that ridge till morning, right? So there's also, in that sort of idea of Übermensch, or the man that you almost can't differentiate between a glorified beast god and a chosen sort of child of an ontology, right? That lights the way, right? For another day, another chance, another opportunity for the pack to survive, right? So in a sense, there is a pack mentality, but then you look at the grotesque morphology of the dog of today, like to breed and to clip the tail to make it cute, right? To breed it and inbreed it so when I say inbreed, I'm talking about inbreeding it with other pack animals, from the dingo to the gray wolf, and then reducing the dog further by giving it these short little limbs and this curly hair that obscures the vision, right? And until you just have something that you have isolated into a lapdog, and now you can laugh at it. You can laugh at little things that as it trips over its feet on its way to just trying to get the one thing that it has, which is ample amounts of food and water. And of course, all it will do is fatten itself. So you could almost say this is an analogy on the pharmaceutical generation of today, right? The ones who were unknowingly placed on pharmaceuticals at a very young age, and they feed the system today. And the next thing you know is these people forget so quickly. The next thing you know is these folks will and are going on dialysis, and people don't see them when they're being, given a ride through Uber and Lyft, right, with these vouchers at the early hours of the morning to go in and endure, 4 hours of dialysis while they die away, right? So there are sacrifices, there are offerings occurring right in front of you, and saying, oh, what am I going to do about it? No, you have enough free time. You got yourself into this sort of middle classing status, right? And all of this was done operationally. You could almost, if you wanted to jump to conspiracies that are proven conspiracies, where you can go on the CIA website and look at this and go, oh, wow, this isn't a conspiracy. People are just too lazy to actually go on the CIA website. I posted links up, even, what's that? Y-Files, right? That ridiculous little show that capitalizes and rips off smaller niche YouTube channels constantly, and then assembles this, right? This is somebody who's a lot of these people are unintentional, right? Like, you don't have somebody who has this strong voice, right? These are the people who slip through the cracks, who become congressmen, who become politicians, part of the Senate. They become familiar faces. They acquire money very easily. They begin to misidentify that they are actually special, when the truth is that they didn't incite any alarms. Nobody was jealous. Nobody was afraid. Nobody felt the alpha presence of the unknown pulsing energy, right? That was supposed to destroy this false networking system by way of the reestablishment of principles. And when you destroy this person, and I do believe that this is biblical, when you destroy this person, this man in society, and you look at this volley, this rally between the underground man, the overman, Nietzsche's overman, and ultimately you see this this synthesis of somebody who becomes this this rebel, borrowing from Ralph Ellis, this rebel leader that very well was most likely also taking from James Cameron's Forward on the Jesus family tomb and the ossuaries that were found there, right? When you begin to look at this culminate into, to use these terms, messianic figure, it's messy, right? But you're looking at somebody, the distortion of a hero, even, the adages and the age-old stories, Heracles or Hercules, right? And what this represents when we look at Solomonic magic, but the Solomonic temple, the link in with even Hiram Abiff, um, the link in with Hermes, you know, and Trismegistus, thrice great, um, the link in um, with Gilgamesh, right? You see how you have, or Abrahamic traditions, right? But you see how you have, or Noah, you see how you have this superior man who was identified and given this, passed this gauntlet by some sort of source, and you're not talking about somebody who is perfect, right? It's somebody who understands perfection, who has brushed against perfection, um, definitely, right? Mastery on some level. This Hiram Abiff that could come up with this seamless joint system of building, right? Where you still have these pyramids that stand today, right? So in this, you have a collective of this networking system where the pawns, the people, right, the proletariat, and this is why people like Zizek can talk about communism in such a way and say, well, it's the natural migration that's occurring even today in capitalism. You just choose not to see it. But when you look at the leaders, when you look at the supply chain globally, you know that communism requires capitalism, requires socialism, requires this multi-layered system that I believe, you can come up with names like, Karen Horney and rail against, or Virginia Woolf, and you can rail against Ayn Rand in such ways and say, oh, that's not the person who carries the feminist gauntlet. But I would say that Atlas Shrugged was one of the most brilliant writings that unveiled this networking system, right? From a purely true feminist view, right? Where Ayn Rand identified edicts. She identified the fact that these are principalities, to use another term, that this isn't principles that these people are following, and that it made its way, when we look at Michael Aquino, right, into military, right, into military law, and that behind these closed doors, there are these really terrible people who are actually operationally going about this contrarian, mechanistic, incendiary firing process as to vote the superior man out, and to say that even if we came up short by employing 10 or 20 people that would make up for the loss in the conduit of the superior man, right? And so again, we have to identify, we're forced, when we use that term, we're forced to identify the superior man. And I'd say it's the one who ultimately has to carry the Promethean flame, right? It's beyond boundaries that the average everyday citizen doesn't have this sort of superpower to withstand, right? The type of pressure, right? And mostly the identification to maintain a self when the environment doesn't offer principle, doesn't offer the bolstering of, the building up, the food, right? When everything is stripped away, this person will still maintain themselves. And we're not talking about some, through the zodiac, we're not talking about some fixed absolute person like Trump who is too stupid and fat and uneducated to even fathom what individuation and the expression of true art, right? Because this does come down to the identification of true art, right? And I think that Zizek identifies this in cinema, because why are we so attracted? Why do we bolster? Why do we pay so much money to watch this almost like fetal alcohol syndrome manifestation? Not to put anyone down who's been through that terrible ailment, right? Life disease, but to say that someone like Ryan Gosling would be hailed as this sort of Übermensch, right? Like the final statement of him playing Ken and Barbie, where you have this sort of thin-toothed, narrowed out skeletal system of somebody who absolutely doesn't represent, and probably is on Anavar to get the abs and in Hollywood, and to say that we are going to hail the inferior man, right? The man who only got there by obvious means of networking, right? not the most talented and conflicted person like a Christian Bale, right? Or not the most amazing actor of our time, a Robert De Niro, who also later on you would see through this polarization had definite issues with delivery into real life. To actually, and he's doing a good job at campaigning against Trump, but be careful you don't stare at those monsters, else you become one. To loosely paraphrase, but to say that in this we are celebrating something that doesn't exist, right? To the point where we now have these movies where the script that would typically be, and this has happened for ages. Like when you look at Clint Eastwood, trust me, I've seen him up close. He's not more intelligent. He's not stronger. He's not better. He comes off with this sort of this cockiness that shouldn't be celebrated in society. This cocky white man's privilege, where everybody, like everyone after Clint Eastwood, ended up having to bear the burden of, fuck that guy, we're going to tear him down, right? Until now you have these, let's face it, these overweight, and we're not putting females down or overweight people. We're saying that the dichotomy of saying, of taking somebody who's supposed to represent strength and putting the antithesis of this in their role, right, in a movie, and to say, well, this person just has the superpower of bitch mode, right? Like you have the sarcasm and the sardonic superpower of bitch mode. You are going to be playing the role of Clint Eastwood, even though you look like a fat, out of shape, middle-aged social worker. And Zach Galifianakis, or that, or however the hell you pronounce it, Snuffleupagus, I don't fucking know. But you have somebody who's just this odd, displaced person who just happens to be funny, like the jester to the king. Let's keep him around, for entertainment, right? And now these people or Ryan Reynolds, this crude, foul-mouthed person who used bisexuality, homosexuality in every single one through redundancy of his stupid little snide, snarky, sardonic weaker man, right? The weaker man who's going to get punched, but he plays the little brother who's going to be a smart ass in the corner, and then everybody ends up aligning with. This goes back to Peter Pan. It goes back to Lord of the Flies, right? To where what you have emergent, and Lord of the Flies didn't get into this properly, right? But we all know that its outcome was more like Animal Farm, right? Where you have this convincing to supplicate, this convincing to take the pill of inebriation, right? To smoke the dispensary weed, right? to take the pharmaceuticals, to just put out the misery of the true boredom and the true displacement of when you stand for principles, you're going to end up on the street. And when you think that society recognized your contributions, think again, because Trump is going to cut that lifeline off, right? And that good riddance, you were not contributing in the first place when society was placed on the shoulders of this Übermensch who was used and discarded because of his heroics, because he sinned against himself, right? Society and the mechanisms of society was fashioned and built to cause the superior man, the overman, the Übermensch, to sin against himself just trying to survive, right? There was no air, there was no respite, there was no safety net, there was no fallback plan. This is the person who had to sacrifice everything to keep the family alive. This is the hero of yesteryear that has now become the brunt of the joke, right? And this is the moment when society collapses and implodes into itself as nothing folds back on nothingness.